Hi, everyone. This is Tori Vandelin with Prevent Connect. This podcast continues the conversation Ashley Klein Jimenez and I had with Keith Kaufman and Elizabeth Letourneau. They are co authors and collaborators of the guide Preventing and Addressing Child Sexual Abuse in Youth Serving Organizations, a desk guide for organizational leaders. Check out part one of this podcast for an overview of the desk guide.
Thank you both so much. I'm really kind of sitting with this idea of being able to separate the goals from rules and really understanding like what are these rules actually trying to get to. And I think, it really resonated with me, Elizabeth, what you were saying, in terms of, creating this organizational culture where rules get broken, and that's just kind of, what happens. I think I've had many experiences where, I've been in organizations or even just like family structure where there's lots of rules, but they don't end up being followed, right? And so it's like, what good is the rule then? And I can imagine that it would be really difficult to implement programs, policies, and practices when they're not coordinated or if they don't fit the context of the organization, or if there's just too many, like the point that you both made. So Keith, you mentioned that there is an overarching framework of child sexual abuse prevention that's covered in the desk guide. Could you walk us through that a little bit?
Sure, I'm happy to help. And Elizabeth, I might ask you if you'd jump in when you're ready. But in terms of that overarching framework, a couple things that are important to know as a foundation. We tried with thinking about this idea of overarching frameworks to really start with some basic principles that was in the research literature and that was really important and critical to thinking about youth serving organizations. We started with the premise of what is a youth serving organization about? What's its goal? And really what we thought about is that there were two primary things that came up front and center. One is that almost all youth serving organizations have some variation of a mission to support a youth's movement towards a successful and satisfying life. And then the other thing that many and most organizations talk about as front and center is making sure that the youth are safe and that their well-being is preserved while they're participating in the programming. So, that was part of the place that we started. We also started with a core focus on the fact that relationships are a really important part of the positive things that go on in youth serving organizations. And there's a variety of those relationships that are critical. It could be peer-to-peer, it could be younger to older youth, it could be very clearly staff to child or staff to teenager. But those relationships are really critical. And that also told us a lot about what we should be thinking about. And in the desk guide, one of the things that is there front and center is this really nice chart that helps the reader think about at a variety of different relationship levels. The individual level, the interpersonal, the child-to-child and peer-to-peer as examples. Also the local organizational focus, what are the policies and procedures, what does that local organization look like, and then also the parent youth serving organization, what are the national guidelines and things. And really want to orient people towards that figure, because that figure really looks at what are some of the important types of safety concerns that come up at each of those levels, and also what's the potential for focusing on those different levels for enhancing safety. So, these are some of the components that we looked at underlying the idea of overarching theories. We also integrated public health theory, that ecological lens we just talked about, and Elizabeth already mentioned the organizational theory being so important in really understanding how organizations function and why it's important to offer organizations this idea of overarching themes that they can use as a core and draw from. And that really ended up being the foundation for the approach. And as Elizabeth said, the essence of it is really asking that question about what is the overarching goal of any particular safety strategy that's going on, and is this the best way of carrying it out? And in the guide, we talk about 8 different areas that we invite people to look at. And our belief is that those 8 different areas really together encompass most all of the safety purposes that youth serving organizations look at. And let me just mention them quickly. The first is focus on child well-being and safety above all else in adult relationships with child caring and professionals. Make training a cornerstone of the youth serving organization practices, increase the visibility of adult-child interactions, collaborate with children and parents in this process, identify safety concerns and generate solutions specific to each youth serving organization's unique child sexual abuse safety risks, increase youth serving organizations' evaluation and accountability, address child and adolescent sexual behavior, and finally focus on human resource management issues as the final of those 8 different areas to focus on. Elizabeth, I'm not sure what you want to add, but I'm sure you could add some richness to that beginning.
I don't know about adding richness, because that was right on the money, Keith. And I guess I would say again, trying to kind of bring this to a more concrete level. Typically, when we think about preventing child sexual abuse in particular, not just responding to it after the fact or detecting it, but preventing child sexual abuse, what we've tended to focus our efforts on is teaching children to recognize, resist, and report abuse, right? So that's what, when schools have child sexual abuse prevention interventions, that's what they have. That's been the standard in this country and elsewhere for decades. And that is certainly one strategy. That's at the individual level. So kind of trying to give the kid some skills to keep himself or herself safe. Likewise, at the individual level, we see trainings for individuals in order to recognize and potentially abusive situations or situations that might precede abuse, what we sometimes call grooming, and to intervene around those. Those are individual level interventions, and that can be very important, but we know that individuals exist within a broader context. It's a broader ecology. And so we want to also be thinking about what are strategies that we could implement that get beyond just the individual level of responsibility. And so there's relationships. People exist within relationships, and certainly within youth serving organizations. Again, the one thing that kind of unites all youth serving organizations, whether their focus is sports or arts or civic enhancement or career development or educational or whatever, is the importance of these adult-child relationships. And so there at the relationship level, we might look at how do we make sure relationships stay safe, again, beyond just the level of the individual, and how do we support relationships in ways to keep them safe and keep them focused on child well-being. At the level of the local youth serving organization, if it's an organization that either exists on its own or is part of a broader network of organizations, what can we do there to ensure robust organizational norms for prioritizing child well-being, as Keith said, robust child safety guidelines and rules and protocols? How do we, are there things that we can intervene at the local level that might improve child safety? One thing that we think may contribute to organizations' barriers in preventing and identifying abuse is really unitary chains of command where it's, the person in command might be the person either engaged in the abuse or maybe just very deeply connected to the person engaged in the abuse, and unitary chains of command can make it difficult for concerns to really get identified sometimes. And then the local YSOs often exist within a national YSO setting. We know lots of national organizations have got many local sites, thousands, sometimes, or hundreds. And there we want to strengthen, governance of satellite entities, right? So how do we improve the norms from the top down, that child well-being and safety is absolutely the number one control. And there it's really important to get leaders to not just talk the talk, but walk the walk. And so making sure that leaders have to go through the same kinds of trainings as frontline staff and volunteers, and that leaders support efforts to address and prevent and address child sexual abuse, and are not somehow conveying that this is an annoying process or some tangential part of their job, but really keeping this central.
Thanks for listening. Parts 3 and 4 of this podcast will be made available soon and will be linked to this podcast on our website.